Okay, so picking up where I left off, George Méliès was a filmmaker who essentially worked to develop narrative filmmaking that we're probably most familiar with as the most commercially viable form of filmmaking that we know today. So 1902, he created his film A Trip to the Moon. I've got a link to the film there if you'd like to check it out. It's actually quite delightful. But you're right, he's using film as this means through which he can take us to another place. So rather than turning the camera onto the world around us, he's using the camera alongside early special effects that he's working on to take us to imagined realms. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to switch gears and talk about the Mexican Revolution. So buckle up, it's an interesting ride. Okay. So, the Mexican Revolution started in response to this leader, Porfiriato Diaz, who had taken power from Benito Juarez. And Benito Juarez was a heroic leader of Mexico who had overthrown Maximilian, who was a French interloper who was trying to take over Mexico. So what we're seeing here is that Diaz reflects this kind of pendulum swinging back to a form of dictatorial rule. So Diaz establishes himself as the dictator of Mexico. And what is most significant about the era that he ushers in is that it's kind of this Mexico is open for business type era. So there's tons and tons of heavy investment coming from foreign business people. This is an era of modernization, but what we also see happening is that this era of foreign investment and modernization stripped 5 million individuals of their land, and it also placed many people who worked the land back into servitude, back into essentially being a kind of serf who works the land but doesn't own the land. So everyone was really mad about that, as you might imagine. So 5 million people had been stripped of their land that they were using to both feed themselves and make money. So what we begin to see in the early 1900s is that this kind of corruption that Diaz's era was marked with had sparked broad opposition. So it starts in the countryside. So the peasants who are bearing the brunt of this kind of era and foreign investment are not having it. They're not excited, right? So they start this revolt against Diaz. And these peasant opposition groups are led by some of the leaders of the Mexican Revolution that we might be most familiar with, including Emiliano Zapata, Pancho Villa, and others. So we also begin to see that people in the city are joining this rebellion against Diaz's rule. So what we see happening here is that the labor unions are joining the fray, and so too are the intellectuals and liberals. And these folks are led by this guy, Francisco Madero. Okay, so revolution starts in the countryside and is picked up upon by folks in the city. So everyone is mad about this increasing income inequality and this kind of removal of people from their land for the benefit of foreign investors. Okay, so what we see happening in 1910 is Mexico called for an election. And so what we see happening here is that Madero, the leader of the rebellion in the city, was looking like he was going to win the presidency. And Diaz was not excited about that. So he arrests Diaz and a bunch of his supporters. But Madero escapes and he flees to the countryside. And this kind of serves as a catalyst for a full-scale rebellion against the Diaz dictatorship. So look what happens as soon as Diaz's power is threatened, he imprisons us. So this kind of served to convince people who may have been sitting on the fence in terms of rebelling against Diaz into joining. So Diaz is defeated and driven from power in 1911, and Madero takes over. And he turns out to be not a really great leader, unfortunately. And so he loses the support of the peasant-led groups that were led by Zapata, and he's also facing a multiplicity of kind of challenges to his leadership as well. So he loses the support of Zapata and the folks that had started the revolution in the first place in the countryside, and we see the rise of this military general Victoriano Huerta, who defeats both Diaz and Madero. And so what we see happening here is this moment that we see the U.S. intervening into Mexican affairs. So we see that the United States is intervening into this internal struggle for power in Mexico and is interested in removing the leader Madero from the presidency. So this is something that we want to keep in mind as we get into our reading by Isabel Serna, because we're going to be thinking about how American film remembers the Mexican Revolution. Okay. The things we want to keep in mind here is that we have this era, Diaz has been removed, and we see the intervention of the United States to kind of tilt the scales of this internal event. Okay, so what we see happening here is that eventually Huerta, this general who had taken power, is removed, and what we see happening in terms of removing him from power is a full-scale invasion of Veracruz by the United States. So this is something that's happening in Veracruz, which is a state, as we may know, that's well known for its oil reserves. So the United States is interested in this region in Mexico for very kind of money-oriented reasons, right? They're not actually interested about the kind of future political situation in Mexico as long as they have access to these very lucrative natural resources, the oil reserves in Veracruz. So then we begin to see this power struggle emerging between folks that would sort of return to the kind of conservatism and period of foreign investment that Diaz had been overseeing, to this revolutionary force of landless individuals who are seeking for major political change. So what we see happening in 1916 is this united group of Carranza, Zapata, and Villa leading this massive group of landless individuals and poor laborers into Mexico City. And we see Carranza taking control. And so he promises to make good on some of the issues that the Mexican Revolution was inspired by in the first place, and that is to abolish foreign land ownership and break up these large haciendas that were essentially enslaving people to work the land. So unfortunately, Carranza did not make good on these reforms, and Zapata, who comes from this countryside revolution background, was not excited, and Carranza sees Zapata as a threat and has him assassinated. Zapata's followers are not happy about it, and so they assassinate Carranza the next year. So we have this kind of continued power struggle and continued struggle for the future shape of Mexico continuing to take shape. But what we want to remember, again, is that the United States intervenes not in such a way to kind of help those who are struggling for greater freedom, but rather to gain access to natural resources that they wanted to make money from, right? So the oil fields of Veracruz. Okay. So then after Carranza passes on, is killed, we see Obregón taking power. And he had come to power by defeating Pancho Villa. So Obregón made this promise that when he took office, he would never run for re-election. Because part of the problem with Diaz is that he was just, essentially president for life, and that led to tons and tons of corruption, and that was, what the revolution was started to overthrow in the first place. But we see Obregón not keeping his promise, and he runs for re-election, and so then Obregón was assassinated as well. And then we kind of see this era in which we have a bunch of conservative leaders who are, not interested in the reforms that were called for by the revolution. So it's not until the 30s, so 1934, that we see the election of Lázaro Cárdenas, who frames himself as a populist, and significantly, he is of indigenous descent. And so he begins the authentic reform of Mexican institutions and the Mexican economy as well. So he accomplishes the land reform, the agrarian reform, and redistributes more than half of Mexico's farmable lands to the ejido system, which is essentially a group of peasant collectives who own the land that they work. So, freeing them from servitude on the hacienda. And then we also see that the oil industry becomes nationalized. So instead of right? A bunch of foreign owners making tons of money off the rich natural resources of Mexico, right? The Mexican government is going to control those very lucrative natural resources for themselves. Okay, so that is the kind of very quick version. I know it didn't seem that quick, but the very quick version of the Mexican Revolution. So the big things we want to think about are takeaways. One, it starts in the countryside led by landless peasants. Two, that the United States intervenes as this kind of adversarial, imperialistic neighbor that's interested in not helping democratic reform, but enriching themselves. So those are going to be two of the most important things we want to think about as we jump into our reading for this week. So when we're thinking about going into Isabel Serna's reading, we want to think about the Mexican Revolution as a media event. So film and photography were really significant in terms of creating a collective memory of the Mexican Revolution for both Mexico and, as we'll see, in American cinema as well. So we want to think about how film and photography are not passive technologies, but they transform and they shape our sense of Mexican national identity, and they also transform and shape right, American understandings of the Mexican Revolution as we see the event being represented in American film. So the figure of Pancho Villa, who we see below here, becomes one of these kinds of central figures, romantic figures, through which the American public learns about the Mexican Revolution. So with all of that in mind, do our reading by Serna and kind of think about the issues and politics of the Mexican Revolution and how film works to tell this story and perhaps misrepresent this story in particular ways. Okay, I'll see everybody in our Zoom meeting, and take care.